And then this is star one. Yep. All right. And then once I hit star one, then you guys are on. Yep.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the 408B2 fee disclosure for the auditor. My name is Gary Sutherland. I'm the CEO of North American Professional Liability Insurance Agency. And joining me today is Lou Harvey, founder of Dalbar, as well as the president of the Fiduciary Standards Board, which is, by the way, our host today. In addition, Ed Lynch, CEO of Fiduciary Plan Governance, is on as well. Ed is an AIFA, and his firm is CFEC certified. Last week, Ed was in Dallas for the AICPA Employee Benefits Conference, where he spoke in a similar topic. Unfortunately, Mary Rosen of the Department of Labor won't be able to join us, as she's had a family emergency and was unable to participate today. Today's webinar will be 45 minutes. We will leave 15 minutes at the end for questions. The session is being recorded and will be available next week to all the participants. We'll send you an email with a link to the webinar. In addition, we'll have some additional resources posted to the NAPLIA website next week. We'll have 3 management letters that deal with 408B2 fee disclosures and the audit, and those will be available as sample language that can be inserted into the management letter. So all that being said, I'm going to have Lou Harvey start us off. We'll run through this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. To begin with, I thought it might be useful to just spend a minute or so talking about the Fiduciary Standards Board as our host. The Fiduciary Standards Board really was established back in 2000, and the mission was to promulgate fiduciary standards across the board, ERISA included. Structurally, experts are invited to contribute content to the Fiduciary Standards Board, and this content is used for education evaluation, so it's a non-profit entity. The Fiduciary Standards Board sponsors the registered fiduciary designation that certifies the holder of that designation as a fiduciary, and it's really the only designation that represents what we call a 24/7 fiduciary. It includes a background check and certification as to the qualifications of the holder, as well as providing a credential document. So that's who our host is. And with that, let's jump right into the subject of 408B2. The 408B2 has been around for quite a while, but what we're dealing with here is an update from the 2012 edition. The purpose of that update to 408B2 was to enable plan fiduciaries, in fact, to carry out their duties. The regulators found that the plan fiduciaries were not carrying out their duties to evaluate service providers, and so they came to the conclusion that they didn't have the information. As a result, the requirements now are for service providers to report the services that are being provided, to report their fiduciary status, to report any conflicts of interest and cost of services. And I can certainly tell you from first-hand experience that many of the 408B2 disclosures that we've seen from service providers dubiously meet those 4 requirements, and that I'm putting it mildly. However, the remaining aspects of 408B2, really the biggest aspects of 408B2, are what plan fiduciaries or plan sponsors are supposed to do. First of all, the plan sponsors are subject to a prohibited transaction violation if they don't do any of the 4 items that are listed here. First is to ensure that they have the disclosure. So it's their responsibility, it's the plan fiduciary's responsibility to make sure that they receive the disclosures that I described before, with those 4 factors included. And then, having received it, they've got to evaluate if services are necessary, the arrangement is reasonable, and that costs are not out of line. This is going to be much of what we'll talk about today, because I think that is the most critical aspect of 408b2. The other two elements, to report service providers who fail to comply, and the other one is to make changes as indicated by the evaluation. In other words, you do the evaluation. If you find something wrong, please fix it. All of that comes down to the simple fact of the duty of the plan fiduciary. Are participants' money being used to pay for services that actually benefit the participant? This, to me, is the important issue. Plan fiduciaries have a duty to prevent participants' funds from being misused. In other words, fiduciaries cannot turn a blind eye to the benefits that participants should derive from these expenditures. Remember, it's spending participants' money in exchange for some benefit. The importance of that aspect of it is really described on the next slide. In this case, we're going to talk about two different plans that have the same costs but very different results. Both of these plans use the same services. Both of these plans have the same demographics, both dollars. They pay 75 basis points in fees against a statistical benchmark of 85 basis points. So if we look at that on the surface, it looks like a perfectly valid plan with low fees. However, when you dig a little bit deeper, what you actually find is that one of these plans, which I've designated as good service, is paying an annual fee of $250,000. And the normal growth rate for plans in the example I'm using here is about 7%. But this good service plan is actually growing at 9%. Now that 9% translates to $1 million benefit to the participant. So in short, the good service plan is spending $250,000 and getting $1 million of benefit. The poor service plan, on the other hand, is also spending $250,000, but they are underperforming by $750,000. So the whole point is you're looking at $1,750,000 difference between the quality of service that you see for exactly the same fee. For this reason, we point out that the Labor Department has defined the requirement as an evaluation, not a simple comparison. A comparison would be easy. Hence, we ask the question, what are the regulators looking for? This language was taken from a speech given by a member of the Labor Department some time ago. They want to ensure that plan sponsors use a prudent process to evaluate the necessity, reasonableness, and cost-effectiveness of service provider arrangements. The question that this yields, was a cost-benefit analysis performed? The first question, was a cost-benefit performed? Second, what was the action that was taken with the results? And I would ask you, do any of your clients want to be in breach of these regulations? The next sort of major issue that we wanted to talk about is whose job is it to comply? Because one of the things that we've found over the year almost that this has been in effect is a lot of confusion as whose job it is to comply with it. According to the DOL, I emphasize simply comparing fees is not enough. Prudent decisions on the part of plan fiduciaries requires both understanding both the cost and the benefit. The cost side is provided by the disclosures, theoretically. The benefit side is something that the plan fiduciary needs to evaluate. Secondly, under the new regulations, the evaluation of the quality of the vendor's services, i.e. the benefits derived by the participants, are equal in importance to the fees. What this all boils down to is that the fiduciary role cannot be fulfilled by the plan's vendors. It requires a prudent process that is initiated, authorized by the plan fiduciary, that is independent of the current vendors.
Lou, just on comment on that,
yes.
Number 2 on that slide is really emphasis in your previous slide, which compares the fees of $250,000 for 2 different plans with hugely different benefits.
Absolutely.
So that number 2 really is emphasized by the previous slide.
Yep. Thank you, Gary. Next, we should look at what we mean by a prudent process. The question that fiduciaries must answer in the prudent process is whether or not participants' funds are being used wisely. So the fees are coming out of the participant's retirement account. Are those fees being used wisely? The plan sponsor, the plan fiduciary, has to develop a prudent process to do this that will maximize the participant's return on investment. But the plan sponsor has the choice. They can do it themselves, in-house, or alternatively, they can outsource. The other key issue here is that that process, one needs to demonstrate that it was in fact used. You know, what evidence can a plan sponsor show that this evaluation was done? They need to have some documentation. There needs to be some record of the fact that it's done. The second aspect are the deficiencies. If in doing the evaluation there are deficiencies, then the 2 questions arise. Can the value of the benefit be improved at the current cost, or can the cost be lowered while maintaining the current benefit? Is it prudent to act? That is the bottom line. We often hear discussions about, gee, well, what's the liability? What's the potential downside of this? And it is in fact quite severe. What we've done here is to highlight, you know, at a very high level, the kinds of things that one is exposed to by failing to comply with 408b2. I should hasten to point out, and I wish Mary was here right now, that the enforcement action associated with this probably is still in the forthcoming. Standing from the Labor Department is that they're going to give a sort of a warming up period to allow people to comply and go through things. So we haven't seen them doing any of the enforcement actions that are indicated here, but this is what's in their wheelhouse.
And I would agree that in my discussions with the DOL, we believe that they'll use software to try to determine, based on 5500, outliers of what they may consider to be unreasonable fees. And we'll start off with probably a letter to the plan fiduciaries indicating that further review may be needed. We expect once that plan fiduciary receives that letter, the first call they'll pick up will be to their auditor.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, Gary, I heard last week that a couple of those letters have gone out.
They've gone out, yeah. Yeah,
so
I heard the same.
Yeah,
they're coming.
It's beginning to happen. And it's on an automated system, so it's not even a case where they have to assign staff or anything. Anyway, why don't you tell us perhaps a little bit about what you see as the auditor's role in this 408b2, Gary?
Absolutely. So the nexus for having this webinar came from a call that I received towards the end of March from one of our auditor clients who was asking for some information regarding 408b2 fee disclosures. Their concern was they received from one of their clients a 16-page fee disclosure, which is actually fairly short. And they didn't know how to interpret it. They were saying, we're the numbers guys and we can't make heads or tails of this. How is our plan sponsor going to? And, what, back to the service vendor and say, you have to provide more clarity or transparency on this because we don't understand it. And that's sort of a common role that we hear. So the auditor's role regarding the 403(b)(2) liability is to evaluate whether a prudent process was used to determine whether it was independent, because the service provider can't benchmark their own fees. That's a conflict. So you need to have in place some type of independent fiduciary or independent evaluation. And there are a number of things that can be done in those areas. You can outsource that, and we'll talk to Ed Lynch, who's on with us today, a little bit about that. You can look at an RFP process or an RFI, request for information, where someone independently was able to review the reasonableness of fees. Once you find an issue with fees, you have to act on it. So you need to have a process. The plan sponsor needs to have a process to have those action items. And you need to determine as an auditor whether the plan is at risk due to high fees. The advised plan sponsor material futures failures to comply. And then you have to document any exposure to plan participants. The other role for auditors is that within the audit process, you may be asked to provide testimony that the plan sponsors have fulfilled their fiduciary duty to evaluate services. This gets into a little bit of a gray area because the auditor is not giving or not opining an opinion on whether fees are reasonable. Rather, what they're doing is they're reviewing the prudent process that was done by the plan fiduciaries to determine whether fees. So there's a slightly gray area. But on the flip side, if the auditor becomes aware of what is a prohibited transaction due to excess fees or failure to comply with 403(b)(2), they have a duty to notify the plan fiduciaries of that. So making sure that fees are considered reasonable, making sure it's a prudent process. The intent of the 403(b)(2) is to transform the well-intentioned plan sponsor into a better fiduciary. And that was on our first slide. We didn't really cover it, but the intent is to make better, well-informed decisions based on more clarity and transparency of the fees.
Gary, if I can just add,
Absolutely.
For anybody who's on board, Dalbar does offer training on 408(b)(2). It's really free. It's no cost. As an auditor, you might want to sign on and go through that training to get some more in-depth knowledge about 408(b)(2) and the various aspects of it. That service is available at our website, ERISAFeeDisclosure.com. www.ERISAFeeDisclosure.com.
And we'll be providing additional details, as I mentioned in the beginning, on that and on some things that Ed is doing, as well as some additional disclosures that we'll have on our website. So examples of inadequate compliance, let me switch here, are accepting plan vendors' fee disclosures which by themselves do not address reasonableness. That's probably the one we get, asked most of. Well, we have all the reasons we have all the plan fee disclosures, but they're all from the vendors. Well, what are we doing with them? And it's also difficult disclosure and the investment jargon. And if the plan sponsor doesn't understand how the fees are being charged and what they are, then that's non-compliance. So they have to understand it. The auditor has to understand it, and that's kind of the basis of today's session. One of the comments that I heard when I met with a number of accounting firms, and specifically the auditors of the employee benefits, was that the margins on this type of services tend to be thin. That was sort of a consistent theme that I heard, that there's not a lot of revenue in it. There's a lot of resistance to paying a lot of revenue to have the plan audited. And so one of the things that we talked about was within the audit process, the ability to elongate the audit, what we're calling spread, the slide that you see up now, and get a higher fee for that. The idea is that you can add value to the audit process by simplifying the understanding of fee and the fee types, providing clarity on direct and indirect compensation, review current service agreements, evaluate potential new service agreements. Specifically, if they're in an RFP process, you might be able to assist the plan in reviewing and working on how the agreements are evaluated. Assist plan sponsors with tools to evaluate the reasonableness. And then the last one, which may be the most important one, develop proposals to reduce overall plan expenses or increase benefits. Again, going back to that slide of the two fees that were both $250,000 with hugely different outcomes. Now I'm going to let Ed join us. Ed's going to talk a little bit about what the documentations are needed for the audit. Ed?
Thanks, Gary. By way of background, Fiduciary Plan consulting firm that focuses on all the activities that are associated with fiduciary arrangements in terms of how they're being managed. We basically create assessment and audit protocols based in large part, when we're dealing with employee benefit plans, based in large part on the process that the Department of Labor uses if they're going to launch or conduct an investigation. The team at FPG is comprised of, at this time, 3 former Department of Labor senior investigators, 2 of whom are JDs, 1 of whom is a CPA, as well as a practicing employee benefits attorney, and some other investment professionals and other parties in this area. I mention this to say that what this slide is about is what we, after analyzing the regulations, both prior to the final being issued and then after the final were issued, we determined would be necessary to conduct a thorough review of whether or not a plan sponsor had complied with the regulations. And you'll see that it's a fairly extensive but not overwhelming list. First, one has to obviously have the 408B2 disclosures from the service providers. Those need to be reviewed. Then the disclosures that are made to the participants, and we look not only for the disclosures that many record keepers in particular have prepared and disseminated to the participants, but we also look to see whether the plan sponsor has in some way supplemented or at least validated that those disclosures are complete. And that's important because what we found is that in many cases where a record keeper is making the disclosure to the participants on behalf of the plan sponsor, they may not properly capture or categorize all of the fees that need to be disclosed and discussed. Agreements to see that they contain necessary provisions and that the service providers are intending to comply with the disclosure requirements. It's helpful to have the current plan documents as well as the summary plan description, and a current investment policy statement, the current fund menu, and some kind of an expense breakdown for the plan is necessary. Copies of enrollment materials and participant statements and so forth. This relates back to the comments Lou was making earlier about the effectiveness of the plan. Is the information being communicated in a way to the participants that they can make informed investment decisions? We look for some kind of a benchmarking RFP or RFI report that is independent of any of the service providers. If it's not there, then it's part of the service that we provide to offer that benchmarking or provide that kind of benchmarking. And then finally, we're going to be looking for the most recent financial statements in the 5500. So you see that there's a bit of documentation that needs to be both accumulated and reviewed. So once we realized what was necessary to comply, we said, well, okay, how can we best assist both plan sponsors but also the service providers and trusted relationships that they have, such as their auditor, their attorney, or their investment advisor. And so what we did was to create a resource that we call FeeSource, which is a fee disclosure assessment process. And we're in the process now of launching the alpha version of a cloud-based tool that plan auditors and your clients and others could use to determine, by going through the new fee disclosure regulations. We have posted a link to the alpha version, and it is a test version at this moment, on our website, which is the address that's here. And if you go to it, you'll see in the windows at the top that there's a FeeSource tool that you can link through to and go through a series of questions that will provide a score as to the degree of compliance. We invite you to do that, and we welcome your feedback on the tool, because we plan to launch a more widely disseminated versions shortly, but we're trying to test this and get the best feedback that we can. So, Gary?
Ed, thanks. And we'll be providing that additional data information as well early next week with the other emails. Ed, I'm curious, you were at Dallas for the AICPA Employee Benefits Conference, and you had mentioned one of the sessions that you tweeted about. If you could just kind of maybe talk about that for a minute.
I think you're referring to the session where Ian Dingwall was speaking, Ian Dingwall being the chief accountant for the Department of Labor. And as would be expected, he spent a lot of time on the fee disclosure regulations. And as you alluded to a little bit, or Lou alluded to a little bit earlier, though the department has indicated that the enforcement of these regulations is not going to necessarily be as forceful as it might otherwise be expected to be, that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen and it's not coming in a more forceful way. And what was interesting to me was the way in which Ian expressed it in terms of speaking to the auditors who were in the audience. And I was, as I do in these sessions, I was running multiple tweets, and one of them that I sent out was essentially the effect that Ian Dingwall has just deputized plan auditors as the first line of enforcement of the new fee disclosure regulations. And I think that's what you're.
I am, and I recognize in my discussions with auditors around that I spoke with in this regard before this presentation, there's a little pushback for them saying, well, you know, we have our own guidelines, and the DOL can say what they want, but you know, we have our own GAAP standards that we have to comply with, and maybe we can do something in the management letter. So that's certainly some pushback. But what I might say is that if the plan receives letters from the DOL, again, I believe that, you know, the auditor is going to be one of the first calls that they make. Maybe their risk attorney too, but at the end of the day, they're going to be looking to their auditor to explain why they weren't able to determine whether their fees were reasonable in this and why they may be dealing with a prohibited transaction. And one of the things that I think that auditors are probably going to find that they were going to rely on if they don't have a really good RFP or a really good independent fiduciary that the plan is engaged to do a review of the plan fees and the benefits, I don't want to forget that piece of it, is that the auditor may want to look outside to an independent person to do that review. I'm going to turn it over to to Lou next for the next slide.
Well, thanks, Gary. And the slide that you see here is the result of an analysis that we did last year based on the 5,500 data filed with the Department of Labor. What we've done is really normalize where fees lay and categorize them into 3 zones. The action zone are fees that are materially above the norm. In other words, fees that are in that red zone are the ones that are most likely to be picked out by a computer to be reviewed, to be examined by the Labor Department, or to be acted on. Those are the easiest ones to spot. The green zone, the comfort zone, are probably the last ones, and in fact where most fees lie. Most fees are actually in the green zone. The third one, however, is the disclosure zone, and that's an area where the fees are too low to be true. The notion there is that the regulators understand that there is no such thing as a free lunch, and if somebody's reporting fees down at that level, in all probability, there is something wrong. There is some failure to disclose, or at least some failure to understand. So this is a handy tool that somebody can use to get a quick snapshot of where things stand. This tool actually supports a process that at Dalbar we use to certify the reasonableness of plan services and expenses, where we actually go in and evaluate the benefits and the costs of the various services that service providers do to determine, in our view, whether it's reasonable. And that sort of independent review is intended to be a prudent process that plan sponsors can use.
And a question for you. Where have you seen where there have been some fee disclosures that have really fallen down? Is it in one area, a record keeper, a TPA, an advisor, or is it kind of all over the place?
In our experience, it's been all over the place. As Lou mentioned earlier, there are many of these disclosures that are anything but disclosures. They are more obfuscation, the one that we will utilize in some of the evaluations that we're doing as part of our fee source process. But as we were doing this, developing this process, what we also began to recognize is that when you look at the way things are, that is what the pricing are and what the distribution is, it wasn't lining up with what we were seeing in other areas of our consulting practice, and that was when we were actually engaged or involved in, say, an RFP process. And what we're finding is that utilizing, simply relying on benchmarking analysis or benchmarking data that's drawn from, say, a database service and so forth, is not really reflecting the reality of the world or the marketplace. And what we discovered is that there's often a huge gap between what a benchmarking would indicate to be reasonable or within a reasonable range and what those services can be obtained for in the marketplace today. And that's where looking for some kind of an independent process, such as an RFP or an RFI, is so critical. Because to really determine if something is reasonable, you have to know what you would pay for it if you were purchasing that service today and you were doing it in a appropriate and prudent manner. And as so what we've done is that we have merged those where, though we don't require for our fee service process that someone go to RFP, if they haven't been out to RFP, say in the last 3 to 4 years, we're going to strongly recommend that they do, because we're discovering overwhelming evidence of some very significant differentials between what may appear to be reasonable from a benchmarking report and what those services can be purchased for. So coming back to what you were saying earlier, Gary, what we see is an opportunity, say, for an auditor who is going to be looking at much of the same data that is necessary to make some kind of a reasonableness judgment with regard to plans, is that here's a potential opportunity either to extend the nature of their engagement or enter into a new engagement, or if they prefer not to do that, to recommend a service that the plan sponsor could use to actually enhance the overall service and cost structure of the plan.
Before I get into some more with you, Ed, I'm going to just ask Lou to comment on the same sort of question. You're seeing it, the disclosures. Have you seen it in one area, or like Ed, all over?
They are. If you look at it by type of vendors, it appears to be all over the place. You have culprits in each category, and we really see three types of performance here. One that I describe as going by the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law meaning providing the plan sponsor with the kind of information that lends itself to decision making, lends itself to evaluation of the services that are being provided, lends itself to the plan sponsor being able to assess the value of those services. That's the spirit of the law. The second category is the letter of the law, where the service provider sits down and takes the specific term in the regulation and answers that. Now, to describe the result of that as hodgepodge is kind, because taking a regulation that's over 100 pages long and line by line answering it is perhaps not very helpful. But that's not the worst. The worst, in my view, is the third category, and that's the pilot on category, meaning you go get a prospectus, you go get an annual report, you go get a statement of additional information, you go get a contract, and you link them all on some website and put a label on top of that package and call it 408B2. There's no start, no end. The best story I can tell you, the best 408B2 story I have is we actually saw a 408B2 disclosure that included the cost of checkbook covers in the list. So you have this enormous list of things that would make it totally impossible for somebody to literally figure out, gee, is this a material cost or not?
And checkbook covers right in there.
Checkbook covers is the one that blew my mind, anyway.
And I'm going to go back to you. Although we didn't produce a slide, I asked Ed if he could talk a little bit about a couple of plans that he has been involved with and the significance in the RFP process.
Sure. Well, the one that, and if any of you that are listening were in Dallas and attended the session where I was a panelist, you saw this, but we had a case recently that we just frankly have closed out the engagement, in which we were approached by a plan sponsor at the prompting actually of their auditor, because they really frankly, partly because of the whole fee disclosure regulation, but also because they felt that as it was their duty to really understand where they stood with regard to, in this case, particularly the fees they were paying to their advisor. So we had an arrangement where we had these are 5 companies that participated in a defined benefit plan master trust. And then they also individually had 401k plans that were all with the same vendor, very similar structures, but different. Supervisor who was working on both the pension plan and the 5 plans, and working with the committee that oversaw this. Plan assets in the defined benefit plan were about $100 million. Plan assets in the 401k plans combined were just under $40 million. And when we ran a benchmarking analysis on the 401k plans, which is relatively easy to do, we found that frankly, their fee structures weren't terribly out of line. There was maybe a 10 or 15 basis point difference, that they were high, but not by an enormous amount. But because it's not as easy to do benchmarking of defined benefit advisory fees and so forth, we then issued a request for information for the aggregate group, both the DB and the DC plans. And that's when things really began to emerge. What we found was that though they were paying what by benchmarking looked to be a fair, little high, but reasonable fee, we found that in the case of the defined benefit plan, they were paying, close to 40 basis points of expense. The average response among the RFP group was 15 basis points. So they're paying nearly 3 times the fee that the RFP group came back with. And the finalist advisors, there were 3 finalists who were invited to present, their average fee for advisory services was 8 basis points. So 1/5 approximately of what was being paid to the current advisor. On the 401k plans, it was dramatic but not quite as extreme. The average fee to the current advisor was 30 basis points. The finalists came in at 9. So again, about a third. $40 million of assets in these plans, they were paying nearly $500,000, $475,500 in combined fees. At the end of the process, the successful advisor who was hired, their total fee amounted to $100,000, a savings of approximately $375,000 in fees that have been paid out to this advisor. That is a dramatic example of the point I was making earlier. Benchmarking alone doesn't tell the story, and there can be very significant, dramatic results that directly impact not only the plan participants, but also in this case the plan sponsors, because so much of that fee was related to the defined benefit plan. Well, that has an immediate effect on their funding. This is not the only one that we've found like this, but we see this as representative in the marketplace. The numbers may be a little more dramatic, but this is what we're seeing.
What you're saying, great. Well, I think we're almost at 45 minutes. I think what we'll do now is entertain some questions. You should be able to type in a question in the question box on your screen, and we will answer some questions. I'll give it a minute for some questions to come in. Ed, one question that's in now that you may be able to respond to. The question is, if the plan sponsor provides us with the fee disclosures, like the one I mentioned earlier, the 16-page one that couldn't identify what the actual fees were, how often should the plan fiduciaries go back to their vendors and ask for clarity and transparency and a better fee disclosure? And has there been a willingness to comply with that?
Well, the answer is that if the plan sponsor doesn't understand the disclosure, then they should request clarification, or they should ask for help in interpreting it. I think of an example of, I mentioned we have one fellow on our team who's who practices employee benefits law, but also works with us as an analyst and a consultant. He was talking about a disclosure that a client of his had presented to him that he couldn't make any sense of. And so he was sending letters back and forth with the entity that had made the disclosure, seeking that kind of clarification. You have to have it because you have to be able to make a determination that the services are necessary and the fees are reasonable. If you don't understand the disclosure, how can you do that?
How can you do that? We have several questions about will we make a copy of the presentation available, and the answer to that is yes. We are recording this. The presentation will be able to go out next week, so any participant that registered will get a copy of that. Can you read the next one?
Sure. The next question here is how many plans were analyzed to arrive at the fee zones? We analyzed the entire 5,500 plan base, which I don't remember right now, but I think it's somewhere around 100,000 plans that are included in that. what structure would the work paper documentation testing for 408B2 be most efficiently completed?
Ed, you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, could I hear the question again?
Sure. It's what structure would the work paper document testing for 408B2 disclosures be efficiently completed?
Well, I'm not an auditor, so I'm not sure if there's a protocol for work papers. So that's why I'm hesitating. But what I guess if I would say if I were going to create an efficient file to demonstrate that we had completed the testing that needed to be done, I would be looking for one, clarity in terms of what the disclosures were and what services were being provided, and then some kind of a report that showed that those have been compared in some independent and objective way to a reasonable sampling of one sort or another, that steps have been taken then to ensure that action was taken if things were found to be out of line or there was an attempt to make corrections in that regard. I don't know if that's fully responsive, but that's...
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Lou's going to add a comment as well.
Yeah. I could certainly talk about the certification of reasonableness that we do. When we do that, we include an opinion letter that details, the findings, and attached to that are, all of the supporting documentation. So that is something that's provided to the plan fiduciary that would immediately give them evidence. So in terms of work papers, it's whether in those cases it's simply a case of whether you have that supporting documentation or not. Because in and of itself, it is complete, and it also includes provision for the plan fiduciary to accept.
For you, the question is how do you typically work with auditors? I know in the past you've outlaid to me that you really can do it in three ways. Sort of behind the scenes, working up front with the auditor, and then working specifically for the plan. Maybe you could just elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, that's correct, Gary. You got it right. I mean, we see ourselves as a resource for auditors if they want to, as many do, you've built a good brand and you want to, this is a service you want to offer, you want us to work with you in the background, we're happy to do so. And in fact, I had a call today with a team that we're going to be presenting to a client with next week. And that's exactly what we were talking about, is how our team will integrate with them to provide the services that we're going to be presenting as an option for this particular plan sponsor. We can do it completely behind the scenes. In other cases, they'll see our service as an extension of what they're already doing. In other words, extension of consulting engagement, extension of services they're providing. But they may want to use us as the independent third party, and particularly when they see the credentials and so forth of our team, they want to be able to tap that and say, well, look at who we're bringing to the table. And then in some cases, we find many will say, no, we do what we do, but we want to be able to present to our clients a resource that they can use that we're comfortable putting forward in terms of the integrity of the process that's going to be provided to them. So we're very flexible in that regard. And just as I said, when we're doing this, we'll use resources like Lou has developed, I should say that Dalbar has developed, as well as others that we think are most appropriate, so we can get the job done in the most effective way.
Okay, I have another question. How do you determine benefit dollars? And I'll direct this to Lou.
Yeah, we've developed an algorithm, and I'll sort of give it to you in brief terms.
Okay.
The whole idea of benefit dollars looks to the ability of the participant to retire. So we look at the elements that add to the ability to retire, which turns out to be growth in plan assets. And that growth in plan assets can be affected by a number of factors that are directly related to the service provided. The first factor is obviously the employee's own contribution to the plan.
Okay.
So are employees contributing to the plan? That adds value to the benefit. Employer contribution adds value to the benefit. The investment makeup adds appreciation to the benefit, because a well-invested plan is going to be growing faster than one that is not, right?
Yes.
Then you have the downside factors that limit it. Withdrawals from the plan. To the extent that employees are taking money out of the plan, whether, for whatever the reason is, that destroys the ability to retire. And we see that as diminishing the benefit. And then finally, we have the popular one of fees. Right? Fees diminish the value of the plan. So we take all of those factors into consideration, and that establishes a norm, an industry norm, which in the example we gave you before was about a 7% annual compounded growth rate. Anything above that would be adding value. Anything below that would be underperforming. So
that's your benchmark.
Yeah.
Okay. Seeing if there are other questions. Ed, any other final comments regarding your Dallas trip that you might want to share?
Well, other than it was probably one of the best conferences I've attended in terms of the intellectual content and the the group that was there. I just thought it was an excellent conference, one we plan to attend on an ongoing basis into the future. It was very revealing what both IRS and DOL had to say in terms of enforcement and what we can expect and where they're looking to take what these regulations are intended to do, and they certainly made clear that they intend to enforce. So in that we may be in a period where enforcement is not as intense, our message to people is, look, there's a way to prepare for this, and it's a way that can be done relatively painlessly and relatively inexpensively, so why not do it?
Excellent. I think based on the fact that there's no additional questions and we're almost at 4 o'clock, we'll go ahead and just finish our slides. Sorry, I'm not able to advance. Bear with me one second. Okay. So obviously Mary was unable to join us, although she is here in spirit because we kind of cited her a couple times. Again, I'm Gary Sutherland, and this is my information. Lou Harvey, founder of Dalbar and president of the Fiduciary Standards Board. Ed Lynch, who's been on, and his information as well. In summary, I'll let Lou sort of recap, as he calls it, the due diligence entails.
Yes. The due diligence process we describe in 5 basic elements here, each of which we've talked about to a greater or lesser extent. Documentation of a prudent process. One needs to have that documentation of that prudent process as evidence that it was in fact conducted. The evaluation process, which we talked a bit about, and the determination of the cost and benefit of services received by the plan. A projection of successfully meeting participants' needs, because we didn't talk about that, but there's obviously the ongoing need day to day that participants, that one has to service participants well if one expects the participants to remain committed to the retirement plan. Next are conflicts of interest that are part of the disclosure, or correction, I should say, that should be part of the disclosures, and making sure that those conflicts of interest are identified and, in fact, addressed. And then finally, that actions are taken in response to any unreasonable findings. And those actions can be, we talked about several of them. One can ask for additional information from service providers. One can actually change the construct of the plan to add benefits or to change the way the plan is constructed. One can find a lower cost alternative for that plan, all of which become outcomes of a proper evaluation process.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank all of our attendees for spending an hour with us this afternoon. It's 90 degrees in Boston. I don't know what the rest of the weather is across where you're there.
It's cool in here.
It's cool in here. I want to thank the host, the Fiduciary Standards Board, for hosting this webinar. I want to thank Lou and Ed for spending some time with me today and giving this presentation. Stay tuned next week for everything that we mentioned, the link to this presentation. Again, it's being recorded, as well as some of the additional resources, both from Lou, Ed, and myself. Thank you very much.